Welcome back, pastors and Bible study leaders. You know those folks who are always looking for fresh angles on familiar scriptures? Well, today we're diving deep, really deep, into Philippians 3:7-11.
It's a passage that's packed with meaning, even if we think we've heard it all before.
Right. But sometimes we need that new spark, that fresh perspective to help bring it alive, right?
Absolutely. It's like looking at a familiar painting and suddenly noticing something you've never seen before.
That's a great way to put it. And that's what this deep dive is all about, uncovering those hidden gems, the sermon illustrations, and unique approaches that other pastors are using to make this passage resonate with their congregations.
Because let's be honest, sometimes the same old commentary can fall a little flat.
Definitely. So we've gathered a bunch of sermons from pastors across the country, and trust me, they're going beyond those typical Christian platitudes.
It's about finding those truly unique insights that can make this passage come alive in a whole new way.
Okay, so let's dive right in. This first sermon, Embracing Transformation, from Oak Hill Assembly of God, really got me thinking. They focus on the surpassing worth of knowing Christ.
Yeah, that's a powerful concept. But how did they approach it?
Well, they didn't just talk about it theoretically, they challenged their congregation directly, asking, what are you willing to lose for Christ?
Now that's getting to the heart of it. It's easy to say we value Christ, but are we willing to make sacrifices for him?
Exactly. And they use this really powerful analogy to drive that point home, is that some people treat Christianity like a spice. You sprinkle a little bit on life to add some flavor.
Interesting. I see where they're going with this.
Right. But is Christ just a garnish in your life? Or is he the main ingredient, the foundation of everything?
It's a powerful image that forces us to confront our level of commitment.
Absolutely. Okay, now this next sermon took a completely different approach. New Life City Church, Kansas City, in their sermon, Valuing Christ, compared Christ to a Van Gogh painting.
Whoa, now that's an unexpected comparison. How did they connect those two?
Well, they talked about how during Van Gogh's lifetime, his paintings were largely ignored. No one recognized their true value until after his death.
And they're using that to illustrate how we often fail to recognize Christ's true worth.
Exactly. We hear about his love and sacrifice,
Yeah.
but do we really grasp the immensity of it? Do we truly treasure him above all else?
I think it's a brilliant comparison. It makes you stop and think, where does Christ actually rank in our lives? If we were to do an art appraisal, so to speak, how valuable would we say he is to us?
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and lose sight of what truly matters.
Absolutely. And the message of the sermon is clear. Christ plus nothing equals everything. If he's not the centerpiece, the most treasured element of our lives, then we're missing the point entirely.
Now, this next one is a little intense, so buckle up. Colton Community Church, in their sermon on the transformative power of resurrection, compared sin to a boa constrictor.
Whoa, okay, that's a vivid image.
Right. They're talking about how sin slowly squeezes the life out of us, suffocating us just like a boa constrictor does to its prey.
It's a pretty dramatic analogy, but it definitely gets the point across.
And here's where it gets really thought-provoking. They argue that only what is dead to self can truly experience the power of resurrection.
That's a powerful statement. What does that death to self actually look like in practice?
Right. That's the question they leave the listener with. What needs to die in your life for that power to take hold?
It's a challenging question, but an essential one.
Absolutely. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, we have Harvest Community Church of Irvine. Their sermon, Knowing Christ, the Path to True Righteousness, explores what it really means to know Jesus.
Because it's more than just knowing about him, right?
Exactly. It's about a deep personal relationship. They actually use a great example to illustrate this. Imagine meeting a famous person.
Okay, I'm picturing it now. The handshake, the photo op.
Right. But does that mean you truly know them? Of course not.
It's just a surface level encounter.
Exactly. It's the same with Christ. It's about going deeper than just knowing facts about him.
And how did they emphasize that deeper level of knowing?
Well, they delved into the original Greek word for rubbish, Skubala, which is what Paul uses to describe his worldly achievements compared to knowing Christ.
Skubala. That's a pretty strong word, isn't it?
It is, and it's not just any trash. Skubala referred to the worst kind of refuse, completely worthless and repulsive. Paul's making a strong statement about the utter worthlessness of worldly pursuits compared to knowing Christ.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It really makes you think about our priorities, doesn't it?
For sure. Now, Encounter Life Ministries echoes that sentiment in their sermon, Knowing Jesus, the Foundation of Our Faith.
Okay, so they're also emphasizing that knowing about Jesus just isn't enough.
Right. They drive home the point that we need a transformative relationship with him. And I thought it was really interesting how they tackled the idea of celebrity worship within Christianity.
Oh, that's a good one. It's so easy to get caught up in the hype of big-name preachers and impressive ministries.
Exactly. But this sermon reminds us that true faith is rooted in a personal connection with Jesus, not in following the latest trends or personalities.
So how did they bring that idea down to earth for their congregation?
Well, they used the analogy of marriage, which I thought was really insightful. They said that a healthy marriage isn't just about knowing basic facts about your spouse.
Right. It's about intimacy, connection, shared experiences.
And it's the same with our relationship with Christ.
It requires intentionality, vulnerability, and a willingness to go deeper.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond that surface level admiration and cultivate a genuine, intimate relationship with Christ.
So moving on, let's take a look at Living Hope Church's sermon, Counting All as Loss for Christ's Worth. They focus on how encountering Christ radically shifted Paul's priorities, to the point where he considered his former life as rubbish.
Yeah, it's a powerful testament to the transformative power of encountering Jesus. Paul went from being this respected Pharisee at the top of his religious game
To considering all of that worthless compared to knowing Christ.
Yeah.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
And what's interesting is that this sermon doesn't just tell us what Paul did, but they explore why he did it.
Ah, so they're getting into the motivations behind his radical change.
Exactly. They use this powerful analogy to illustrate this. Imagine your house being completely level to the ground, but then it's rebuilt even better than before. It's a complete overhaul, a radical transformation.
Okay, I can see where they're going with this. It's a complete renovation of the soul.
That's what Christ does in our lives. He reorders everything, making us new creations.
Now that raises an interesting question, especially for those of us in ministry. What does that leveling look like for someone leading others in faith?
Right. Are we truly allowing Christ to shape our leadership? Or are we clinging to our own agendas and ambitions? It's a question that deserves some serious reflection.
No doubt about it. So let's circle back to Colton Community Church. Remember them?
Ah.
The boa constrictor folks. Well, they had another sermon on this passage that I found really thought-provoking.
Ooh, what's this one about?
It's called Embracing the Power of Resurrection in Daily Life. They emphasize that resurrection power isn't just something we experience in the future, but we can tap into it now.
Okay, that's interesting. How do they explain that?
Well, they make this fascinating connection. Just like a seed has to die in order to produce new life, we have to let go of our worldly desires to experience this resurrection power.
So it's about surrendering our own will to embrace the life that God has for us.
Exactly. It's about dying to self so that Christ can live in and through us.
And they connect this back to our everyday lives, especially for those of us in ministry.
Oh, so...
They ask, where do you see the need for this dying to self in your ministry? Are we clinging to control, or are we allowing God to work through us?
That's a tough question, but a necessary one. It's a reminder that true leadership is about service and surrender, not about power or self-promotion.
Well said. You know, it's pretty amazing how each of these sermons brings a unique angle to Philippians 3:7-11. There's so much depth to uncover when we look at even a familiar passage through the lens of different pastors and their ministries.
Absolutely. It reminds us that the Bible is a living text that continues to speak to us in new and relevant ways. There's always more to learn, more to discover, and more to be challenged by.
Now, before we move on to the next batch of sermons, I think it's worth taking a moment to consider this. If Paul were writing to pastors and church leaders today, what might he consider rubbish in our modern context?
Oh, that's a really thought-provoking question. What are the things that we might be holding on to today? You know, those things that we've elevated to a place they don't deserve that could be holding us back from truly knowing Christ and experiencing his transformative power.
It's definitely something to ponder as we continue our deep dive into this passage. But for now, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we have even more sermons and illustrations to explore.
I can't wait to hear what other gems we uncover. You know, it's interesting to think about how Paul's background as a Pharisee might have shaped his perspective on what he considered rubbish. I mean, he was at the top of his game religiously. He had the credentials, the knowledge, the status. And yet, he was willing to walk away from it all when he encountered Christ. It really makes you think about what we might be holding on to those things that seem so important in the moment, that pale in comparison to knowing Jesus.
Absolutely. And speaking of letting go of things we value, the next sermon we're diving into is from Grace Covenant Church. Their message, humility. The gateway to knowing Christ makes a compelling case that true humility is essential for experiencing Christ's transformative power.
Humility. Yeah, it's not exactly a celebrated virtue these days, is it? It seems like our culture is all about self-promotion and achievement.
Exactly. And this sermon argues that this mindset can actually be a major obstacle to knowing Christ. They point out that true humility involves recognizing our own limitations and our complete dependence on God. So it's not about putting ourselves down or denying our gifts, but recognizing that everything we have ultimately comes from God.
Precisely. They use a really great analogy to illustrate this point. Imagine a small child trying to carry a heavy suitcase. It's just too much for them to handle on their own.
But with the help of a parent, they can manage it easily.
Right, and that's the point they're making about humility. When we try to do things on our own strength, we're like that little child struggling with the suitcase. But when we humble ourselves and rely on God's strength, we can accomplish far more than we ever could alone.
It's such a powerful image. I think it really speaks to the heart of what it means to be a Christian, surrendering our ego and pride and allowing God to work through us.
Absolutely. And the sermon challenges listeners to examine their lives and identify areas where they might be clinging to self-sufficiency rather than embracing humility. It's about recognizing our need for God in every aspect of our lives.
And I like that they offer practical steps for applying this concept to daily life.
Yes, they had some really helpful suggestions like practicing gratitude, seeking feedback from others, and being willing to admit our mistakes. It's about cultivating a posture of humility in all that we do.
All great points. It's so easy to get caught up in our own little worlds and forget that we're not in this alone.
Yeah.
We need God and we need each other.
Well said. Now, let's shift gears a bit to a sermon that took a more philosophical approach to this passage. This one comes from Redemption Hill Church, and it's titled The Paradox of Gain Through Loss.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. What's the paradox they're talking about?
It centers on this idea that in order to truly gain Christ, we have to be willing to lose everything else. Our old selves, our worldly ambitions, our selfish desires, all of it has to go.
Which, on the surface, seems kind of counterintuitive. Why would we want to lose things in order to gain something?
Exactly. That's the paradox. But the sermon argues that it's only through this process of surrender and letting go that we can truly experience the fullness of life that Christ offers.
So it's about recognizing that what we might perceive as loss is actually a gain in disguise.
Precisely. They use the analogy of a sculptor chipping away at a block of marble. At first glance, it might look like the sculptor is destroying the marble, removing pieces, and creating a mess.
But in reality, they're shaping it into a beautiful masterpiece.
Exactly. And that's how God works in our lives. He often chips away at the things that we're clinging to, the things that we think define us, in order to reveal the true beauty of who we were created to be.
It's a beautiful analogy, and I think it speaks to the transformative power of God's grace. It's not about our efforts or our achievements. It's about allowing God to work in and through us.
It certainly does. And the sermon goes on to explore the implications of this paradox for our daily lives, encouraging listeners to embrace the process of letting go and trusting God to shape them into the people He wants them to be.
So it's not about striving for perfection on our own, but rather surrendering to God's transformative work in our lives.
Precisely. Now, for a completely different perspective, we have a sermon from City on a Hill Church titled The Cost of Discipleship. This one tackles head-on the challenges and sacrifices that come with following Christ.
That's something I think a lot of pastors and Bible study leaders wrestle with. How do we present the cost of discipleship without scaring people away?
It's a great question, and this sermon offers some helpful insights. They start by acknowledging that following Christ is not easy. It often requires us to go against the grain, to swim upstream, to make choices that are unpopular or uncomfortable.
No sugarcoating there. I appreciate their honesty.
Right, and they use the analogy of a marathon runner to illustrate this point. Running a marathon is not a walk in the park. It takes intense training, discipline, and a willingness to push through pain and fatigue.
And I imagine they're comparing that to the Christian life.
Exactly. They're saying that following Christ is not a sprint. It's a marathon. It's a journey that requires endurance, perseverance, and a willingness to embrace the challenges along the way.
So it's not about promising people a life of ease and comfort, but rather preparing them for the inevitable difficulties that come with following Christ.
Right. But here's the key point. The sermon also emphasizes that the rewards of discipleship far outweigh the costs.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's a sense of hope and joy that comes with knowing Christ and experiencing His love and grace.
Absolutely. They use the image of a mountain climber who reaches the summit after a long and arduous climb. The view from the top is breathtaking, and it makes all the struggle and effort worthwhile.
That's a powerful visual. It's about keeping our eyes on the prize, the ultimate goal of knowing Christ and experiencing the fullness of life he offers.
Precisely. And that's the message this sermon leaves listeners with. The cost of discipleship is real, but the rewards are eternal.
Okay, for our next deep dive, we're heading over to Cornerstone Church. Their sermon tackled a topic that's often overlooked in discussions of Philippians 3:7-11. It's called The Power of Paul's Testimony.
Now that's an interesting angle. What's their focus here?
Well, they start by pointing out that Paul's words in this passage aren't just abstract theological concepts. They're rooted in his personal experience, his own radical transformation from a zealous persecutor of Christians to a passionate follower of Christ.
So they're emphasizing the power of personal testimony to connect with people's hearts.
Exactly. They argue that Paul's story has the power to resonate with people across cultures and centuries because it speaks to the universal human longing for meaning, purpose, and belonging.
And that's something we can all relate to, regardless of our background or beliefs. We all have a story, and those stories can be powerful tools for sharing the gospel.
Right. And they point out that Paul's story isn't just about his own personal conversion.
Yeah.
It's also a testament to the transformative power of God's grace.
And that's a message that's always relevant, isn't it? No matter how far we've strayed, no matter how many mistakes we've made, God's grace is always available to us.
Absolutely. They use a powerful image to illustrate this point. Imagine a piece of coal being transformed into a diamond under intense pressure.
Wow, that's a striking visual. They're suggesting that our trials and struggles can actually become catalysts for growth and transformation.
Exactly. They argue that it's often through our greatest challenges that we discover our deepest strengths and experience the most profound growth.
And that's certainly true of Paul's story. He faced intense persecution, imprisonment, and hardship, yet his faith never wavered. His story reminds us that we can overcome any obstacle with God's help.
It's inspiring, isn't it? His example reminds us that we can overcome any obstacle with God's help.
Absolutely. And this sermon encourages listeners to share their own stories of God's grace and transformation, recognizing that our personal testimonies can have a powerful impact on others. Sometimes hearing how God has worked in someone's life can be more impactful than any sermon or theological argument.
Okay, next up we have a sermon from New Hope Community Church that delves into a theme that's central to this passage, but often gets overshadowed by the more dramatic aspects of Paul's conversion. Their message is titled, The Pursuit of Intimacy with Christ.
Now that's a topic that's close to my heart. What was their approach?
Well, they started by pointing out that Paul's desire to know Christ wasn't just about accumulating knowledge or information. It was about a deep, personal relationship, a longing for intimacy with the living God.
And that's a distinction that's so important to make, isn't it? Knowing about Christ is not the same as knowing Christ personally. It's like the difference between reading a biography of someone and actually spending time with them, getting to know their heart.
Exactly. And they used a really beautiful analogy to illustrate this point. They talked about the difference between reading a travel brochure about a faraway land and actually experiencing that place firsthand.
I see where they're going with this. So reading about Christ in the Bible is important, but it's only through personal encounter and experience that we truly come to know him. It's about moving beyond head knowledge to heart knowledge.
Precisely. They emphasized that pursuing intimacy with Christ is a lifelong journey, a process of drawing closer to him day by day through prayer, study of Scripture, and obedience to his will. It's about cultivating a deep and abiding connection with him.
And that journey is not always easy, is it? It requires intentionality, discipline, and a willingness to be vulnerable before God. There will be times when we feel distant from him, times when our prayers seem to go unanswered, times when we struggle to understand his ways.
Right. They acknowledge that there will be times when we feel distant from God, times when our prayers seem to go unanswered, times when we struggle to understand his ways.
But even in those times, they encourage listeners to keep pressing in, to keep seeking his face, to keep trusting that he is faithful and that he desires to draw close to us. It's about persevering in our pursuit of him, even when it's difficult.
It's a message of hope and encouragement for all of us who long for a deeper, more intimate relationship with Christ.
It certainly is. Now, our next sermon takes a slightly different angle on the theme of knowing Christ. It comes from Calvary Chapel, and it's titled, Knowing Christ Through His Sufferings.
Okay, now that's a topic that can be a little challenging to unpack. How did they approach it?
Well, they started by pointing out that Paul's desire to know Christ included a willingness to share in his sufferings. This wasn't some kind of masochistic impulse. It was a recognition that true intimacy with Christ involves entering into the depths of his experience, both the joys and the sorrows.
So it's about recognizing that suffering is an inevitable part of the Christian life and that it can actually draw us closer to Christ. It's not about seeking out suffering, but rather recognizing that when it comes, it can be a means of grace, a way of deepening our relationship with Christ.
Exactly. They acknowledge that this is a difficult concept to grasp, especially in a culture that values comfort and ease above all else. But they didn't shy away from the tough questions. They explored the theological and practical implications of this idea, challenging listeners to consider how their own experiences of suffering might be opportunities to know Christ more fully.
It's easy to feel lost and alone in the midst of suffering, but this sermon reminds us that we're not alone. Christ is with us, even in our darkest moments. And it's often through those difficult times that we experience his presence and comfort most deeply.
Absolutely. Now, for our final sermon in this segment, we have a message from Christ Church that takes a more practical approach to the idea of knowing Christ. It's titled Living Out the Gospel.
Okay, I'm all for practical application. What was their focus?
Well, they started by emphasizing that knowing Christ is not just an intellectual exercise or an emotional experience. It's about living out the gospel in our daily lives.
So it's about putting our faith into action,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Exactly. They challenge listeners to consider how their relationships, their work, their leisure activities, all aspects of their lives could be transformed by the gospel. It's about letting our faith permeate every area of our lives.
So it's not about compartmentalizing our faith,
Yeah.
but rather allowing it to permeate every area of our life.
Precisely. And they offered some really practical suggestions for how to do this, like practicing forgiveness, serving others, and sharing our faith with boldness. It's about letting our light shine in a dark world, demonstrating the reality of Christ's love in tangible ways.
Great points. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness of life and lose sight of what really matters. This sermon reminds us that our faith should be reflected in everything we do. It's about being doers of the word, not hearers only.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap up this segment, I think it's worth noting that all of these sermons, despite their different approaches and emphasis, point to the same central truth. Knowing Christ is the most important thing in life. It's a truth that's easy to affirm intellectually, but much harder to live out consistently.
It's a truth that's easy to affirm intellectually, but much harder to live out consistently.
That's true. But I think these sermons offer us encouragement and guidance as we strive to make knowing Christ the foundation of our lives.
Absolutely. And I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more insights and illustrations as we continue our deep dive into Philippians 3:7-11. So stay tuned, because we've got more thought-provoking sermons to unpack in our next segment. It's really amazing to see just how many different ways pastors are approaching this passage in Philippians, 3:7-11. As we go through these sermons, I'm struck by how each one manages to bring something new to the table.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like we think we've explored every nook and cranny of a passage, and then boom, someone comes along with a fresh insight that completely changes our perspective.
It's a good reminder to stay humble and open, right? There's always more to learn.
Absolutely. Speaking of fresh perspectives, this next sermon from Bridgetown Church really got me thinking. It's called The Radical Reorientation of Desire.
Okay, that title alone is pretty thought-provoking. What's their angle?
Well, they really dig into Paul's statement about considering everything else as rubbish compared to knowing Christ. But they take it a step further, exploring how this radical shift in perspective actually reorients our desires.
Our desires. So it's not just about what we believe, but about what we want, what we long for.
Exactly. They're talking about a fundamental change in our motivations, our entire way of life.
That's a pretty big deal. So how do they illustrate this concept?
They use a really powerful analogy. Imagine a compass that's been thrown off course by a strong magnetic field. Our natural desires, they argue, are often like that compass, pointing us in the wrong direction.
Okay, I see where they're going with this. And encountering Christ is what sets that compass straight again.
Right. It's like a recalibration, aligning our desires with God's will and purpose for our lives.
So it's not about suppressing our desires entirely, but about transforming them.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that true fulfillment comes from seeking God's heart, not chasing after our own fleeting desires.
Which, let's be honest, is a constant battle, right? We're bombarded with messages from the world that try to pull us back into those old patterns of thinking and desiring.
Oh yeah, for sure. But this sermon reminds us that even in the midst of all those distractions, we can keep our eyes fixed on Christ and allow him to reshape our desires. It's an ongoing process.
Well, that's encouraging. Now, for a slightly different angle, we have a sermon from Mosaic Church titled The Surpassing Worth of Christ. It seems like a lot of these sermons are really grappling with that idea of considering everything else as loss for the sake of Christ.
It's a powerful concept, but not always an easy one to swallow, right?
Especially in a culture that prioritizes comfort and self-fulfillment. This sermon doesn't shy away from the cost of discipleship, though. In fact, they embrace it, exploring the idea that following Christ often involves sacrifice.
A willingness to let go of things we might value highly to embrace something far greater.
Exactly. And they actually use a pretty interesting analogy to help us understand this.
Oh, I'm curious. What is it?
They compare it to an investor who sells everything they own to invest in a venture that promises a much greater return. It's a bold move, for sure, but if the payout is significant enough, it's worth the risk.
And their point is that following Christ is the ultimate investment.
One that yields eternal dividends. It might require us to let go of some things we hold dear, but the reward is infinitely greater than anything we could ever gain in this world.
It's a good reminder to constantly be evaluating our priorities, asking ourselves, what am I holding on to that might be preventing me from fully experiencing the surpassing worth of Christ?
Great point. Okay, now let's shift gears a bit to a sermon from the Village Church titled The Mystery of Knowing Christ. I appreciate how this sermon acknowledges that knowing Christ isn't as simple as checking off a list of doctrines or having an emotional experience.
Yeah, it's so much more than that, isn't it?
Right. It's not just about accumulating knowledge or information. It's about entering into a deep, personal relationship with the living God.
It's a mystery, one that we can only begin to grasp through faith and experience.
Exactly. And you know what? They actually compare it to a vast ocean. We might be able to explore the surface and learn some facts about it, but the true depths remain hidden from view.
Oh, I like that. So we can learn about Christ, we can study the scriptures, but there's always going to be more that we don't know.
And that's how they describe our understanding of Christ. It will always be limited, but that doesn't mean we can't experience the depths of his love and grace.
That's about embracing the mystery, approaching knowing Christ with a sense of humility and wonder.
Right. Recognizing that we'll never fully comprehend the infinite depths of his being.
It's a humbling thought, but also an exciting one, don't you think? The more we know Christ, the more we realize how much more there is to know.
It's a journey that will continue for all eternity. As we wrap up this deep dive into Philippians 3:7-11, it strikes me that even with all these diverse perspectives, there's this unifying thread, this central truth. Knowing Christ is the most important thing in life.
It's a truth that challenges us, inspires us, and compels us to live differently.
Absolutely. And as pastors and Bible study leaders, we have this incredible privilege of sharing this message with others, helping them to discover that surpassing worth of knowing Christ. So as we go back to our congregations and study groups, let's remember to approach Scripture with fresh eyes, with humility, and with a willingness to be surprised by what God might reveal to us.
And may we ourselves be continually transformed by the power of the gospel, allowing it to shape our lives, our ministries, and our relationships. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it as insightful and inspiring as we did.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the Word.